break between each of the three parts, just so you know what's coming. It's amazing that you guys are studying the Sermon on the Mount, and you're certainly not alone. Many people are. I preached in Atlanta on Sunday. They're doing the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, that's a slip, I think. It's also probably a joke. The Sermon on the Amount is about preachers trying to get money. Okay. My text was Matthew 5:33-37 on oaths. But actually, we had a really great time. And I told them that this Sunday, I'm speaking from Matthew 6 in Fayetteville. And the people who use this material, particularly the iFaith material, in the underground churches in Asia, they're also doing Sermon on the Mount. And I've now recorded 24 out of 26 lessons for them. So it seems like the whole world is studying this really important bit of Scripture. But I do have North Carolina connections. My mother was brought up in Wilmington. She went to Chapel Hill. So did three of my cousins. Well, all three of my cousins. My uncle went to State. I was at Duke. That was my first college. And I was attracted to Duke partly by the architecture. I was trying to go to the West Coast because we lived in New Jersey. So I was hoping to get far away from the East Coast. And I saw in some college book, there's a college called Reed, R-E-E-D. It's not a misspelling. That's the name of the college. I thought, that sounds good because that's in Oregon. I remember my father redirected me. That's a bit far away. Maybe consider, and he introduced me to Durham. And I always thought it was my decision, but before he died, he told me, no, he kind of engineered the whole thing, pushing me in that direction. It was there that Gary Knutson met me. He had just got his first master's degree from Duke the year before. And I was the first person he ever baptized. And I'm really grateful to him. He still lives in North Carolina, Gary. And that was at the Coal Mill Road Church of Christ. I also have family in Charlotte, where I was earlier this year. So we are connected. The Sermon on the Mount is often viewed as a single message. It could be. I'm not really going to address that right now. What I'm going to address is the meaning of it. And as you can see clearly, look up there in verse 1 of chapter 5. Seeing the disciples, he went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him. He opened his mouth and taught them, saying, ... I'm going to try the other side here because I have 4 mini HDMI drives, slots. Whoops. I need that. And then we read also in chapter 8, verse 1, when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. So 5:1, he's going up. 8:1, he's coming down. But if you look closely, he's not teaching the crowds. He's just teaching that small number of men who were following him. So we may envision it as Jesus speaking to thousands of people. Not there, at least not the way Matthew explains it in chapter 5. So that's what's called the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. All right. I can do this without slides, I guess. I mean, I love the material. You'll just miss all my cool pictures. Historically, this has been considered kind of the essence of Jesus' teaching. In fact, just came back? No.
I'll take your computer and put it in the back.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it's back. Just don't touch it.
Wait, don't move.
Just don't touch it.
Stand there. It's like the TVs in the 50s and 60s. You get up to adjust the signal and it's fine, and you sit down and it goes, just stay there. And if not, but then I would need yours because the range of my clicker is only about 10 meters.
But we'll just not touch it.
All right, careful. All right. So, a compendium, it's short. It's the essence of Jesus' teaching. In the early centuries of Christianity, Matthew seems to be the favorite gospel. And you say, why do I say that? It was nothing against the other three, but if you look at the thousands of pages that have been written by early Christians in the first few centuries, Matthew is quoted more than the others. So people are quite fond of it. Certainly not the longest gospel, that's Luke, but Matthew was the favorite gospel. And what I will suggest today is that Matthew gives us a lens through which to understand discipleship. Not to take away from the Great Commission, but if our understanding of discipleship is only in relation to evangelism, it's only in relation to reproducing ourselves, that's way too narrow. It's not that it's incorrect, it's just incomplete. But discipleship is much more about the kind of people we are. And you've got the remote for me?
Yeah, I'll just take it. Sorry, guys.
That's all right. Okay, you might want to take the power source too, because it only lasts 2 hours.
Plug, I'll plug you back in the back and you can run it. It'll be smooth. Yep, all good. Thank you.
So how many of you have read the Sermon on the Mount recently? Oh, not many. Did you know it was on this topic today? In Scotland, in our small group, our church, we meet Sunday evening, but we focused on Matthew last year. Actually, I had about 30 sermons just from the Sermon on the Mount. In the autumn, we did a new series, which you may have seen at my website. It's simply called, that too? The Prism, Jesus in the Old Testament through the lens of Matthew's Gospel. And it was eye-opening for me. I think our group, we have some very young Christians and some very old Christians. Everyone learned. But if you don't know the Old Testament background of Matthew, you'll miss it. That's kind of the number one key, being a good student of the Old Testament. So we really, really enjoyed that. And that became my January series. I redid it for my annual January series, those 31 quiet times. And then now we're going through the Gospel of John. But meanwhile, in China, they say, please give us Sermon on the Mount. So I'm redoing it in the iFaith series. So I'm really into this. Now you can see what I see, right? Which is nothing? Okay, good. Just testing you. Now, this is all intro. Notice what's included in the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes, the blessings. Salt and light. Fulfilling the law, really by loving others. He gives us 6 challenging areas to focus on. And there's giving, fasting, prayer, other things like treasure in heaven, judging, narrow gate, prophets false and true, disciples false and true, builders. Okay, if this is meant to be, if this actually is the essence of Jesus' teaching, where are the things that should be there? Like Sunday contribution. The church is never mentioned. Midweeks are not mentioned. There's no fine point of theology. There's nothing directly about evangelism, certainly no plan. What is there? I'm just saying that and letting it hang in the air because many of you realize, maybe we would get those other things better if we focused where Jesus focused. Now, each of these 3 sections this morning will go through one of the chapters. However, I'll only be doing selections. I cannot do all of it. That would be crazy. We'll read a lot of it, but if you want more, I'll tell you how to find more later on. And there's 7 phrases or 7 words that I've put this material under. And the first one is character. Now, when we look at the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who long for justice or righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, those who make peace, and the persecuted, the 8 Beatitudes. Each one of those is a sermon. Surely you know that. But what do we see? These are for everybody. Problem I have is that more and more Christian leaders in most denominations, including ours, think of these passages as being feminine virtues. The fruit of the Spirit is certainly a good thing. If you're a guy, though, and you're not quite so loving or gentle or self-controlled, that's okay, especially if you're effective. Even if you're a Christian leader. In the evangelical world, you could be covering up a scandal. You could actually have some fatal character flaws, but as long as the crowds come out, it's considered okay. This is a change, by the way, and this change has been going on, especially in the last 50 years or so. And I could develop this a lot more. That would take half an hour. But these are not feminine passages. These are for everybody. Now, I'm not just blaming the trend on society. I'm part of that too. When I was a young Christian, I'm in my 5th decade now, getting near the end of the 5th decade. And when I first became a Christian, I loved the passages on sacrifice. Passages where people suffer, ideally, and then die. I loved Luke 9:23. That was the only passage I actually knew when I was baptized. I just didn't know much Bible. I wasn't brought up reading the Bible. I would come to passages like Colossians 3. Dearly beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion. And yeah. Okay, I could read quickly over that and get to the good stuff. In chapter 4, about taking advantage of your opportunities in evangelism. Yeah, okay. And maybe you were like that, I don't know. But the Sermon on the Mount is actually, I think, describing who Jesus is. And so to say that what's important are your results, not this sappy stuff, is really wrong. Who knows which book of the Bible is quoted from most in the New Testament? Well, I heard Isaiah and Psalms. There's actually one more that's in the top 3. It's Deuteronomy. So in the Torah, Deuteronomy is the most quoted. That's the one Jesus uses all 3 times, fighting temptation in Matthew 4. In the writings, it's the Psalms. In the prophets, it's Isaiah. There are lots of prophetic quotations in the New Testament. Guess how many of them are from Isaiah? 90%. So if you've not taken time to go through Isaiah, you're going to miss out a lot of the New Testament. And this is one of those many passages which you'll recognize from when Jesus in Nazareth unrolled the scroll and preached, and they really liked him a lot for 17 minutes. They took him out to execute him. But the Spirit of the Lord's upon me, good news to the poor, binding up the brokenhearted, liberty to captives, to comfort those who mourn, and so on. You look at these messianic passages, and feminine's the wrong word, but I'm just saying that character qualities are key. And I think you could look at the Beatitudes, if you want it, as a description of Jesus. So don't say that's just for someone else. This is for us, especially men, because in our culture, far more now than 50 years ago, what is highlighted, what is celebrated is toughness. You know, the things real men do, and the kind of things they would rather not be seen doing if their friends came around. So that's changed. Now, immediately after the Beatitudes, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt becomes foolish, how will it be salted? It's thereafter good for nothing. but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Flavor or function? Normally we think of salt as something that enhances flavor. When I was a kid, we put salt and pepper on everything. My parents would say, taste it first. Now, I still put pepper on pretty much everything. Salt, almost never, unless it's a bland, boiled, a steamed vegetable. Maybe I put a tiny bit on, but I figure we have enough salt in our diet anyway. But it was, the function of salt in the ancient world was that it preserved things. If you didn't want things to rot, you could freeze them. If you're an Eskimo, you could salt them. You could smoke them, hang them up and smoke them, a way of preserving them. It's not a recreational activity. But salt. And we're called to be salt. How? Well, through the power of our example, through our faith, through our outreach, our prayer. In the late 300s in Constantinople, John Chrysostom, John the Golden-Mouthed, a powerful Christian leader, wrote, "This is the nature of salt, which is what Jesus wants us to be." So for salt not only preserves itself, but also preserves other objects with which it comes into contact. So salt is about, it's not just, oh, salt, oh yeah, you're more interesting, or you're salty, whatever exactly that means. There's an idea of preservation. But what happens if the salt becomes foolish? You're wondering, what translation is that? Well, a number of them. And that's actually what it says. And I know that in Fayetteville, you had a sermon not that long ago that spent a few moments on that idea. The original says, if the salt becomes foolish, moranthe, foolish. How was this understood? I can give you quotations. I'm going to give you some quotations from early Christians. Origen, a very committed man, brilliant guy, lived in the 180s up to, I think it was 254. He said, if the reason in us sins and we do something foolish, then we must be fearful of that statement of the Savior, which says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt becomes foolish, it's of value for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled on by men. He knew what it said. Now, right now, you're probably still struggling. How can an inanimate object be foolish? It's like saying, this table here, it's somewhat lazy. Or saying these artificial flowers are immoral somehow. These are things. So I understand what you're thinking. But Paul uses the same term in Romans 1. He describes how people have turned away from God. They became fools. Emoranthesan. Jesus uses a form of the same word, moroi, in describing the foolish guy in Matthew 7. And we also have the foolish virgins. Same word. I think the idea is this. If we, who are salt, we're meant to have an influence and even a kind of preservative impact on the world, because the world's spiraling out of control. But if we become foolish, he cannot use us. We're fit for nothing but to be cast out and trampled underfoot by men. And you'll see similar wording in Matthew 7:6. So if your version says if the salt loses its saltiness, that's really not that helpful. Because what we're saying is if we lose, we're no longer having that kind of seasoning, that kind of impact, that preservative effect on others, then we are foolish. We're not doing what Jesus made us to do. So please, think about that. If it's a new concept, consider it. In short, he's calling us to not lose our identity, our Christian distinctiveness. So let's not make discipleship about external things that can be measured easily. It's about our influence and our heart, what flows from a holy and godly lifestyle. What's the application? It's broad, but it's also narrow. It has to do with conversation. And on your own, you can go back and look at Colossians 4, which speaks about our conversation being seasoned with salt as we talk to non-believers. Has anyone here been around any non-believers this week? Unless you just got out of solitary confinement or something. Everyone has. So the question is not which event do we invite them to? Did we remember to get their phone number? This is, maybe that's effective, maybe not. The point is, how are we influencing them? God is going to do something through us. What will be our impact? Because of what we say, what we don't say, how we live around them. So, like salt, we're called to be light. And as has been often remarked, these verses are not so much about things we do, it's about who we are. It's who we are, what God sees. We're the light of the world. We're the salt of the earth. In English, we still have that phrase, salt of the earth. A good, down-to-earth fella, woman who's, she may not be high up in her profession, but just a wonderful person, salt of the earth. Sometimes you hear people say that. It comes, of course, from the Bible. So do a couple hundred expressions common in our world, but most non-Christians have no idea that they're from the Bible. And then holiness. The other thing I want to look at in chapter 5, although more briefly, is the call to be holy. So you remember the structure of 5. He sits down, you've got the 8 Beatitudes, then he elaborates a bit more on persecution, then we've got salt and light, then he talks about the relation to the law, the Torah, which people had misunderstood. He gives 6 examples and ends up telling us to be perfect in 5:48. I think what he's saying here is what James says and what Paul says, is that by loving others, we fulfill the law. I would like to develop that a bit, but I won't right now or anytime this weekend. Jesus gives 6 practical areas. You've heard it said, right, don't kill, but I say to you, what? Don't even get angry. Now, this is not a brand new teaching. In the Old Testament, it was okay to get ticked off because God himself had a short fuse. I mean, that would be totally false. Lots of passages in the Old Testament remind us that God is slow to anger. Like with the Canaanites, Genesis 15:16. Abraham's time, the sin of the Amorites, the Canaanites, had not yet reached its full measure. But in a few hundred years, God would do something. God's a lot more patient than you and me. And you have passages like Leviticus 19. Now, I think we all know Leviticus 19:18, because that's the number 2 command in the whole Bible. But what does it say right before that? Don't hate your brother, don't despise your brother in your heart, but speak to him frankly. You don't hate people in your heart. That's an Old Testament teaching. It's not a New Testament teaching. Psalm 4, in your anger, don't sin. In fact, it's better not to get angry at all. In the Bible, virtually every time someone gets angry, something bad happens. Now, I used to say, well, if it's righteous anger, like you're a leader and your group's a bit slow and you get angry, that's righteous anger. No, I think that's almost always sinful anger. When humans get angry, it could be justified and righteous. I mean, if you walked into your house and someone was abusing your child or something, yeah, not to be angry would actually be ungodly. But in nearly all instances in our lives, when we're angry, we're already sinning. Think about that. The second area Jesus refers to is lust. This is not an Old Testament, a New Testament teaching, it's old. You remember Job 31? I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a woman. They knew the difference between desire and action. Deuteronomy 21, the captive woman. Ancient Israel was only in a handful of wars authorized by God, and if you study these wars, you see that if they win, it's never because they're stronger militarily. In fact, half the time they're not even fighting at all. It's all God. But if there's a captive woman and she's pleasing to you, you could take her as a wife. After she's had a month to mourn the death of her family, then you can marry her, and if you ever divorce, you have to treat her as fairly as you would anyone else. Now, this is radical. Some people say, I have a bad attitude already. So they allowed you to it's like a sex slave. No, that would be what the Canaanites would do and the Egyptians and everybody else. What the Israelites were told is, the only way you're going to have sex with that captive woman is if you marry her, and you're going to have to wait a month, at least, if you're going to do that. That's radical. It may not be words of comfort, but it is a good answer to those who make an objection that the God of the Old Testament and the law itself are somehow unjust. True love waits. True love waits. That's kind of a theme of Song of Solomon. I was last month in Shechem. They call it Shechem. It's one syllable, Shechem. Can you say that? If you have gum in your mouth, careful or it will fly. Shechem. But do you remember Shechem? He saw Dinah. Dinah is Jacob's daughter. Jacob has 12 sons. And Shechem really likes Dinah, so he violates her. They're not married. He has sex with her. It's a scandal. But he's actually willing to do the right thing. He says, I'll marry her. And yet it said he loved her, and it ends in total disaster. That's Genesis 34. But in Genesis 29, Jacob falls for Rachel. He loves Rachel. And he agrees with her brother Laban, who functions kind of like her father, because her father's out of it. Uncle Laban, you could call him, makes a deal. And even then he swindles Jacob. And how long does Jacob wait for Rachel? 7 years and 7 days. He still has to work an extra 7 years. But that's in Genesis 29. But it said that those years went by, it seemed like just a few days because of his love for her. Compare that to Shechem in Genesis 34. The Old Testament is full of illustrations about the kind of people we should be. I think Jesus is calling people back to the heart, to stop trying to deceive God or others. A third area. Well, this is the area in order. Divorce, which I won't go into right now, but if I understand it correctly, the Old Testament gives lots of protections, especially to a woman who will be divorced, that she did not always have in society. And not only that, divorce was not justified for just a single act, like you slept with someone else. There are 4 grounds of divorce in the Old Testament, and I'm almost certain that those 4 still apply in the New Testament times. In other words, we need to have righteousness in the family. Oaths, what I preached on Sunday, it sort of connects to divorce, because divorce is warranted if you go back on your wedding vows. That's a pretty solemn promise, isn't it? But oaths, and my point in my message was integrity. Then non-retaliation. Every day, most of us are tempted to retaliate. It could be on the highway. It could be in the kitchen. It could be in the classroom or the bedroom. It could be anywhere. We're tempted to retaliate and say, don't tread on me. And sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, and I'm American, and that's not right. It's not right. And then, of course, loving enemies, which is very closely connected to non-retaliation, because if they retaliate you, you can't retaliate them, all right? The idea. And it's actually scandalous. And I think the early church understood very well what Jesus meant. And I will just say this, many soldiers died because they became Christians and then they refused to obey orders that would involve killing others. That all changed, of course, when the church became aligned with the state in the 4th century. Loving enemies, like God does. God loves your enemies. My next door neighbor, who I've been reaching out to since we moved to Scotland almost, 2.5 years, he's from Ukraine. We often go on walks together. We did this before what he calls the beast from the east invaded his country. And he's admitted, the last time we talked, he said it's getting really hard to love them. That is the Russian soldiers and Putin. Interesting, because soon after the invasion, I asked him one day, so do you pray for the Russians or only for your army? No, I pray for both. You know, these people are being sent in by a bad government. And I think, he said, I think most of my fellow Ukrainians understand that these Russians are being exploited. You know, it's not them we have the attitude towards. However, with more and more death and destruction, he said, it's getting hard to keep loving. So this is kind of a sticking point. But what Jesus said, pretty clear. None of these 6 areas is easy. If you think, well, yeah, I'm fine in all 6 areas, let's go to the next slide. You can say that if you want, but I think they're actually really hard. I think they're very hard. And we can take, at this time, because we started a little bit late, can we just do 5 minutes of Q&A? And I would only ask you to be extremely brief and concise, and I will repeat your question, probably. Does anyone have a question on what we looked at, which was Matthew chapter 5? I didn't mention the final verse. He just says, be perfect then as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's connected to the loving your enemy section, the one that maybe is the hardest to get our head around. But when he says perfect, I don't think he's saying, if you ever slip up, boom, I'm going to destroy you. I think perfect in the older sense of that word. Perfect means complete or mature. In fact, we may say in relationship to God, it's about holiness. Striving to have the heart of God, the character of God. Okay, anyone?
Hey, Doug. So?
Oh, hello.
Hello. Retaliation. Is there ever a time